Paul Silas, former NBA player, former NBA coach, died yesterday at the age of 79 years old. I found out the reason for his death was cardiac arrest, so he died of a heart attack. I'm not surprised since Paul was a very big guy. But I just want to go into details about Paul Silas. First thing I want to mention is just his career achievements, at least at the NBA level as a player first. So he was a three-time NBA champion, a two-time NBA All-Star, two-time NBA All-Defensive First Team, three-time NBA All-Defensive Second Team, which shows that he had a pretty good career. He wasn't a Hall of Famer, but he had a very good career. I would say just below Hall of Fame level. So you had to give it up to him for that. Just amazing NBA career. Very few people are lucky to have. It's really hard to go to even one All-Star game. He did that twice, and he got to be a champion three times, along with winning two All-NBA Defensive First Team appearances. Just that's phenomenal. Total five NBA All-Defensive teams. Two out of three of his championship teams were on the Celtics. It's the 74-76 team. He was also on the 79 Seattle Sonics team that won the NBA championship, which is legendary since it was the only championship that the Sonics won in their franchise history, which makes it very unique since the Sonics no longer exist. Also, he was an NBA coach, and he was a pretty good NBA coach, I would say. His record, let me just look at his all-time record coaching wise. I'm just trying to pull that up here. If I can find it. I just saw it a second ago. I'm just trying to find his record. Yeah, here it is. So he had a total of 387 wins, 488 losses, which was a 44% winning percentage of all time. I know some people would say, like, how could he be a good coach if he was coaching below 500? One thing you got to factor in, Silas got dicked over at the start of his coaching career. For 3 years, he coached the Clippers during the early 80s. As you know, the Clippers, for most of their franchise existence, was a pretty shitty organization up until 10, 12 years ago when things started to change. Prior to that, they were the laughingstock of the league. So Silas didn't ever have a fair chance to succeed in that situation. Just it was kind of like meant to fail, or that saying built to fail. That's really what was his situation was with the Clippers. He had his most success with the Charlotte Hornets when he took over back in 1999 during the lockout season. The Hornets had a terrible record due to Glenn Rice sitting out that year due to his fallout with management, and then them having a bunch of injuries to key players such as Anthony Mason. They started the year, I believe, out 4-11, so it's a terrible start. They finished the season above 500 with Silas taking over once Cowens resigned as their head coach. And this is what I really remember Silas for. I grew up in North Carolina during the 90s, and I got to see a lot of Charlotte Hornets games. Just it was amazing to see him coach. Just he had this aura about him that he kind of like had this Mufasa type of vibe going, in the sense that this guy was an elder statesman and the players looked up to him like as a fatherly figure. That was always a vibe I got from him. He was a very strong-willed man. You could see in his interviews, but he was also a gentle spirit. So it's very rare you see a combination of someone who's very strong and also very gentle. That to have that is amazing. To have that duality, I would say, is very rare. One thing I do remember about him during his time as a Hornets coach was that he had feuds with Anthony Mason. They had confrontations where they got up in each other's faces, and he wasn't scared of Anthony Mason. Keep in mind, Mason was one of the toughest guys in the league back then. This guy was a straight up bruiser, but Silas wouldn't back down to him. Silas was never scared of his players. He was a old school coach in the sense that he was very hard nosed, that he would give it to you. He was blunt, he was honest, but he was fair. And I think that's why his players loved and respected him. I remember that. Just he had those strict guidelines, but he was also a very likable guy, and I think it helped with his players. I know, for instance, Baron Davis became an all-star player underneath him as his coach, that he would always tell Baron what he expected from him and what he wanted to see him improve on, and Baron would do that. I think part of the reason why Baron Davis' career started to fall apart was because when the Hornets fired Silas, when they moved to Nolens, just things weren't the same. He wasn't held accountable. There was no other coach that could check him the way Silas could, because Barron actually had some fear of Silas, that even though Silas was old, that Silas could whoop his ass if he got out of line. And I think that was a huge reason why Barron's career didn't live up to what it should have been. He should have had a Hall of Fame career, but I think that fell apart because he didn't have a coach that could hold him accountable. And I think that was Silas's greatest strength, was he could hold his players accountable. He wasn't fearful of any of them. He was willing to get up in their faces. I think that's something that's really lacking in this current NBA. There's very few coaches that are hard-nosed, that won't back down to their star players and would give them tough medicine, would actually tell them what they need to improve on. I also remember him when he became the Cavs coach. He got to coach a young LeBron during LeBron's first 2 years in the league. That was a very interesting experience in the sense that he was the only coach, I feel, that LeBron could not intimidate, that he was the only coach that wouldn't back down to LeBron. That was part of the reason why LeBron did not like him, allegedly, that Silas actually would kick out his friends and entourage from the Cavs locker room, and it pissed off LeBron. LeBron was furious about it, and eventually the Cavs would fire him. I don't know if LeBron was behind it or if he had any influence, but the Cavs fired him during his second year with them, and I thought that was a bullshit firing back then, because he had led this team to an above 500 record, which no one had expected in LeBron's second year, because, again, as good as LeBron is, no one expected him to be able to lead the team above 500 that quickly. And a lot of it was due to Silas putting in his schemes and structure and organization that allowed the Cavs to get better that quickly. But Dan Gilbert didn't like him. I think part of that reason was that he fired him was since Silas was the guy that the original Cavs owner picked. I think his name was Gordon Gunn. He was Gordon Gunn's original pick, and Dan Gilbert had bought that team during LeBron's second year and wanted to pick his own guy. It was kind of like a regime change. He didn't respect Silas because Silas was a gun guy, and that's really what caused him to get fired, I think, ultimately. After that, he didn't coach for several years, but he returned back to coach in Charlotte when they were the Bobcats, and he coached them during those 2 years. His first year with them was decent. They were slightly below 500 in the games he coached. And the next year, you can't fault him for it, because the Hornets were intentionally tanking for Anthony Davis, that they finished a miserable 7-59, but that really wasn't his fault. That was mainly the Hornets trying to tank. And I think if you take that season out of the equation, Silas's coaching record would be above 500. So that's one thing you got to factor in there. But just an awesome person, just a great ambassador for the game. One thing I found interesting about Silas that I read about today was, even during his final years, after he was done coaching, for sure, he would still coach in these rec leagues in North Carolina for like 10-year-olds. I thought that was pretty cool. It showed that he still had love for the game. So just amazing, man. And he left a legacy behind his son, Steven Silas, who is the coach of the Houston Rockets. And I think that is also a reflection of Silas as a man. I remember reading an article during the late 90s when I was a kid about how Paul Silas did not like his father. He thought his father was a rotten person who didn't treat him with respect and was abusive, but he was determined that when he became a father, he would treat his own son better, which he did, from all accounts, what Steven has talked about, that he was a great dad. So I thought that was pretty cool, because there's a lot of people who can't break family curses, I would say, but Paul Silas was able to break that horrible cycle in his own family and be a great father, unlike his father. So that's one thing I respect about him as a man. And one thing I'll say is that it does suck when good people like Paul Silas pass away, but we also must remember that he got to live a full life, and he was blessed to live that. And I think as NBA fans, we were blessed to experience this man. So rest in peace, Paul Silas, and thanks for your great contributions to the game of basketball.